I'm Joshua Bishop. I've been a research scientist at a national laboratory, a reverse engineer, a published poet, the CEO and CTO of several successful tech startups, and a high-level consultant to Fortune 100 companies. In this show, I will apply what I learned in all of these areas to world events, the systems that connect our institutions, history, symbolism, and more. Through the use of pattern matching, systems thinking, and reverse engineering, I will demonstrate ways of looking at these things differently than what you might hear elsewhere. This show is apolitical. I don't care about any particular party or candidate. It's non-ideological, although I have my own biases. And I promise to always tell you the truth as I know it to be, while changing my mind as I get more information, and owning it when I realize I'm wrong. What I won't do is lie to you. If you find this material valuable, please like, subscribe, and share this. Leave a comment, write a review, or donate to my Patreon. This is The Pattern. Today I'm going to talk about the inversion and assimilation of virtue. What does that mean? This is the idea of taking someone's desire to live by or support a particular virtue, and then using that desire to incentivize them to participate in something that is the exact opposite of the virtue. A somewhat imperfect example of this is an episode of the TV show Black Mirror called 15 Million Merits. Spoiler alert, I'm going to talk a little bit about this episode, so if you haven't seen it, skip ahead about a minute and we'll get past the spoiler part. In this episode, there's a sort of authoritarian technological society in place that rules over everyone. People have to ride bicycles to earn credits and provide power to the system. There's also a talent competition TV show, sort of like America's Got Talent or X Factor or one of those. And it offers a kind of a lottery-style hope of escaping the system for a select few people. There is a man named Bing who tries to rebel from the system by getting on the show, and he pulls out a shard of glass. He threatens to cut his own neck in protest of the system. The hosts of the show encourage him to speak his mind and let him rant. They then give him his own show where he can continue to rant every week while holding the shard of glass to his neck. His rage and rebellion, which were intended to cause a revolt or an upset of the system, are converted into more entertainment in service of the system. This is an inversion of his intention and an assimilation of his method. In this way, the system evolves and becomes more resilient to threats. So he started off as a rebellious threat and ended up getting converted into something that powers the system fully. Another way to look at this is virtue redirection. This is the idea of taking a person's desire for virtue and redirecting it to ends you could have never gotten them to do in any other context. An example of this might be Christianity taking individuals' desire to serve God and be a good Christian and redirecting it towards things like the witch trials, violent forced evangelization and conversion, the Crusades, the burning of ancient cultures' texts, etc. You could argue that some of these actions were undertaken by sadists or church leaders who had psychological problems, but many average people participated or supported these actions because their sense of virtue got redirected. Another example might be the global war on terror. People had a desire to protect innocents from being hurt or killed by terrorist actions, a fairly straightforward virtue. This virtue is then redirected in order to pass very dangerous legislation, start multiple wars, and generate racist or anti-cultural hate against Middle Eastern people and Muslims. It's easy for people to feel justified in very damaging actions if it seems to be in service of a virtue. Now, contrary to what the news or social media might say, your average person in general all share or have an interest in things like protecting the environment, avoiding war, helping the homeless, feeding the hungry. No one really argues with these things. although there may be never-ending arguments on how to get there. There's accusations that this group hates the homeless, this group are warmongers, things like that. I want to tell you the story of one example of how these types of goals or virtues get subverted and used for unexpected purposes. Several years ago, I was living in Southern California while working on a tech startup. I started to notice that in front of grocery stores, there would be a young person asking people to sign a petition as they went in and out. Often they had a little table with some literature and a clipboard. The people looked a little strange, kind of out of place, maybe a bit disheveled, and I began to wonder what it was all about. I talked to a friend of mine who was from the Pacific Northwest. He'd long been involved in activism and petitions, political activism type stuff. So I asked him if he knew anything about this. He told me, yeah, I used to do that sort of thing. It's actually a job. A company hires you, usually buses you to another state to gather signatures and raise awareness for some kind of campaign for a period of time. After a couple of months, they would bus you home or pay you and leave you to find your own way. I found this really interesting, so I decided to start talking to some of these people and see if I could find out more. One day I stopped in front of a Ralph's grocery store and asked one of these young men what he was doing. He said, "I'm gathering signatures in support of protecting the environment. The county of San Diego wants to develop over precious wetlands and endangered nature areas, and we're trying to stop it." Sounded reasonable enough to me. I had seen several people sign these petitions, and I could understand how it would pull on their desire to protect the environment. I asked him, "Do you do this for a living?" He said, "Yeah, it's a job." So I said, "Could you give me any more details on the proposed development or what you're protesting specifically?" He said, "I don't really know all that much, but there's some pamphlets on the table that you could take to find out more." So I asked him where he was from. He said he was from San Francisco and that he had been bussed out to do this job. So I asked him, "Is this some kind of company that you work for?" "Yeah, it's called Victory Petitions," he told me. So I said, "Oh, what all do they do?" And he said, "I really don't know. I got hired, they told me what to do and where to go, and that's about it." So I thanked him for his time, and I declined to sign the petition since I really didn't understand what it was about, and went off to see what I could find out about this company, Victory Petitions. It took a little work, but I discovered that Victory Petitions was a subsidiary, or a sort of shell organization employed under something called Golden Door Properties. At the time of this podcast, Victory Petition seems to have disappeared. So I don't know if they were just set up for this particular campaign or what exactly happened to them. After some digging, I discovered that Golden Door Properties LLC operates a resort in Escondido, California called Golden Door. It's a very beautiful resort. It provides guests a place to stay, access to Japanese gardens, all kinds of typical spa activities and amenities, skincare products, yoga, things like that. I found this very strange. Why would a resort be involved in running an environmental petition against the county? Maybe the owner is an environmentalist. I decided to look into who owns Golden Door and found out that their current owner and CEO is a woman named Joanne Conway. Joanne Conway, as it turns out, is the wife of Carlyle Group co-founder and billionaire Bill Conway. She purchased the resort for around $25 million and renovated it several years ago. So who are these people? I was unable to find any photos or very much information about Joanne, but her husband Bill is a public figure. His firm owns or invests in most of the big-name defense contractors, everyone from Raytheon to Booz Allen, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, and they also own fast food companies, energy companies, communications, media. They essentially own a lot of big-name organizations or are core investors. They were heavily involved with the George Bush administrations as well. Mr. Conway himself is worth nearly $3.5 billion. So I asked myself, why would a billionaire, a high finance defense contractor family like this, be involved in a San Diego resort? I decided to look into the type of people that visit the resort and was able to find a few different articles about it. The resort hosts what are called men's weeks and women's weeks events. The men's week, which is the one I could find the most information about, sounds like a sort of exclusive retreat for elite men. It costs $10,000 a week to stay at the resort, and the type of men who stay there are typically billionaires or multimillionaires with power and influence. These guys are leaders of industries such as Hollywood, large financial organizations, and things along those lines. I was starting to see a pattern. In Forbes, there was an article about this $10,000 a week men's week, and they highlighted a couple of the individuals that were staying there during that time. So first we had a guy named George Diamond. He owns a company called West Coast Redirection in Canada, and I was able to find that he was awarded the Order of British Columbia, which is sort of an honorary award, like the Order of the Garter, Knights of Columbus, these sorts of things. Another one of the men staying at the resort during this event was a guy named Alan Fisher. He's a managing partner in a large financial advisor firm, and he was a former president of one of Wells Fargo's different component companies. Then there were two brothers, Jim and Ted Pettus. Jim was a big-name Hollywood producer. He's worked on a lot of well-known movies, things like Raising Arizona, Barton Fink. He owns a company called Colt 45 Records that produces music, and a film company called Circle Films. His brother Ted owns a kind of an interesting company called C Corp, which provides or Science at C Corp. And what this company does is they provide cruises, sort of like a luxury cruise for astrological events or astronomical events. So they might take you to a particular region of the Earth during an eclipse or other types of events along those lines. So the next thing I did was I looked into the proposed development project, which was called Newlands Sierra, to try to understand what was going on here. I found the San Diego government's documents about the proposal, their environmental studies, zoning changes, and all of those sorts of things. I found some maps outlining where the project was to be located, and I compared this with Google Earth maps of Golden Door's location. And what I discovered was that they're basically right next to each other near Highway 15. The plan was approved by county supervisors, but after lawsuits, petitions, and other actions, something called Measure B, or a Better Choice Measure, was put out in order to get the community to vote on whether or not the development should be allowed to go forth. From what I can tell, the project was supposed to build around 2,000 lower-income homes, schools, parks, commercial spaces, essentially develop an entire set of neighborhoods, stores, just a new community for people to live in. The development seems to have been supported by the Republican Party, several mayors, and the opposition to this ballot measure was from the Democratic Party, the Sierra Club, and other environmental groups. I wondered if these other environmental groups included victory petitions. Something that stood out to me in one of the articles that I read in the San Diego Times is that the opponents to the measure had collected around 117,000 signatures from residents in order to block the project. This was definitely a result of the victory petitions efforts that I had run into at the grocery stores. I was curious if the Carlyle Group had done any political funding or lobbying, so I went over to a website called Open Secrets, which publishes information about donations that companies or individuals make to political parties, PACs, and political candidates. For 2020, members of the Carlyle Group and its affiliates, and I say affiliates because typically what happens is they'll build a secondary organization and then use that to pass the money through to the political organizations. Their affiliates had given almost $4 million to political PACs and specific candidates, including Joe Biden, Mark Warner, the DNC Services Group, the Republican National Committee, and organizations like that. This put them as ranking about the 185th highest contributor to political campaigns. Something I didn't really understand until I started looking into this stuff is that these types of organizations donate to both Democrats and Republicans in almost equal measure, sometimes making small adjustments as different campaigns shake out. I couldn't find any information specifically tying donations to any groups in San Diego. However, they did donate to the parties themselves, which trickle funding down through the regional party apparatuses. I took a look at a 2018 legal filing by Golden Door and the Sierra Club regarding the development. They originally filed separately, but later consolidated on Golden Door's request. I found it interesting that these two organizations were teamed up together on this issue against the County of San Diego. Taking a quick look at the Sierra Club, who most people have probably heard of, I've heard about them for a very long time. I looked into their main donors and entered a maze of charitable foundations, action nonprofits, and advocacy funds. If I kept going down this rabbit hole, I'd end up with pins and strings connecting photos all over my wall like a crazy person. It's so complex, so many different directions. I did notice a couple of interesting donors, though, like the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, something called the Advocacy Fund, the Schwab Charitable Fund, and most interesting was the Sea Change Foundation. The Advocacy Fund is one of those organizations that helps sort of wash the trail between who it grants money to and who the donors are. So if you're a very rich person, you want to give money to an organization, but you don't want anyone to know that you did that, you would pool your money with other rich people into this fund, and then they would hand out parcels of money to whoever you wanted to donate to. So it's difficult to make a trail there. Now, the Sea Change Foundation had an interesting sounding name. So I gave it a quick look and found out that it's run by hedge fund manager Nathaniel Simmons and his wife Laura. This is where it got a little bit crazy. I found an investment fund called Breakthrough Energy Ventures that has as its founders, board, and management a list of the who's who of rich and powerful elites, including the Carlyle Group and the Simmons family. So obviously they know each other. They work together on the board of this particular group. While taking a look at that, this led me to a Senate report about a secret billionaires club and how they've captured the EPA and various scientific institutions. Because they are using charitable funds and nonprofits, all of the money that they are using is tax deductible. It's considered charitable and hard to trace back. Essentially, it's a complicated approach for funding political activities under the guise of charity and environmentalism. So they can kind of push, legislation, policy by donating to various groups that then lobby or impact the political process. Looking at this report, it definitely has a political bias in its tone. It seems to be a Republican-driven report, and it's pretty negative about the Democratic side of things. But a bit of research showed that many of the points made in the report were valid, and these organizations with money coming from these particular individuals do exist and act as the report states. One of the quotes in the report that I found most interesting was, "Public charity activist groups discussed in this report propagate the false notion that they are independent, citizen-funded groups working altruistically. In reality, they work in tandem with wealthy donors to maximize the value of the donors' tax-deductible donations and leverage their combined resources to influence elections and policy outcomes, with a primary focus on the EPA." Now, this seems to match pretty closely what I saw with victory petitions and Golden Door and things along those lines. At the end of the day, the measure ended up being defeated in March of 2020, and I found a quote from the No on B, which is the sort of the campaign against this particular measure, the spokesman Rich Slosh. One thing that stood out to me in his quote was when he said, "We will be ready for whatever they try next." He talks about how he sort of implies, without specifically saying, that the county had done something that they really weren't supposed to do, and that, San Diego residents didn't believe their last-minute claims. Kind of disparaging but not direct remarks against the county. Slosh, as it turns out, is the owner of a big PR firm, and that firm has served giant banks like Bank of America, telecommunication companies like Verizon, General Motors, the NFL, other very large corporate interests. I couldn't find any specific tie between him and Golden Door, or the Carlyle Group, or the Conway family, but that's not entirely surprising. These sorts of operations use different organizations, law firms, and pathways that are somewhat confusing to sort out. So what is the pattern here? Well, first, I'm not surprised that Republican groups want to support and develop available land. Building lower-income homes and commercial space represents a ton of money in construction costs, taxes, advertising, and all of that sort of thing, often associated with business and politics. I'm also not surprised that Democratic groups want to defend the environment, protect natural areas, and defeat whatever the Republicans want to do. However, what I caught a glimpse of in this particular example is a vast behind-the-scenes machinery that doesn't seem to care about political party affiliation, and which takes advantage of public perception and a desire for virtue, in this case, protecting the environment, to achieve its goals. I wonder how many of the people signing those petitions understood that while it might protect a wilderness area from development, it also benefited a billionaire resort that has a strong interest in not having lower income housing surrounding it. These rich and powerful people like to have their retreats and social events in exclusive, private, and secluded places, often in nature, and in places where it's difficult for the media and the public to see them. I was invited to one of these retreats in Northern California near the Russian River, and I got to see firsthand how they go. Now, nothing really nefarious happened there. It was really an event for networking. Different leaders of the particular industry that I was representing at that time, meeting each other, forming relationships, making deals, discussing directions that they wanted the industry to go in over the next year, and some partying, good food, and then fun events like rafting down the river or, different things in the wilderness there. So while I didn't see anything nefarious, I can understand why these people want to have these sorts of events because it benefits their businesses and their interests, as well as gives them some time outside of the office and the normal environment. I don't really have any idea what the motivations of the Conways, Golden Door, or the Carlyle Group are. Maybe they are well-intentioned environmentalists, although this does seem to conflict with some of their business investments. I recommend not focusing on one organization or individual, but rather to look for the patterns. This is just an example to illustrate the concept of virtue inversion and how it's done from organizations through campaigns and activism into the population, and to highlight the behind-the-scenes machinery that people may not be aware of. Are people who care about lower-income families having affordable housing being manipulated to serve the interests of land developers and construction companies? Probably. Are people supporting political parties based on the virtues that they claim in their campaigns, while those parties end up doing the opposite of what they said behind the scenes? Definitely. How does a regular person reconcile the conflict between two virtues, protecting the environment and providing affordable neighborhoods for lower income families? I don't know, but I'll bet Rich Slosh's PR firm might have some ideas.